everyone and welcome to Knit Cat Paddywhack. Today I'm going to be sharing 10 tips for knitting on a budget, so I hope you enjoy. Please post your own tips for knitting on a budget down below in the comment section, and if you enjoy this video please remember to give the video a thumbs up, and also you might wish to consider subscribing to my channel. I have a regular knitting podcast on this channel and I share everything relating to knitting and other fibre arts. So let's get into it. I have been a knitter on a budget since I learnt to knit, which is getting on to 11 years now. And when I learnt to knit I was 20 years old. I was a student at university, making money from babysitting and working in my parents' business part-time. As you can probably guess, I wasn't earning a lot of money. I spent several more years after that studying and with comparatively little time in a professional career as well. I'm now a stay-at-home homeschooling parent and my family and I live off of one income. Despite this, I have been able to continue my passion for knitting. On top of this, I have always been a thrifty person and I have always enjoyed saving money when I can. So a few months ago I saw another knitting podcaster, Anushka of the Crimson Stitchery, share her tips for knitting on a budget. And she doesn't know that I am making this video, but I did really enjoy her tips and I learnt a lot. So I will link her video below if you're interested in watching hers. But I was inspired by her video and I also thought, you know, I have some things to add to this conversation because I am quite experienced at knitting on a budget and it's something that I'm quite passionate about really. So here are my 10 tips for knitting on a budget. Tip 1. Learn to substitute your yarn. So if you've fallen in love with a pattern but you can't find the yarn that you want at an affordable price, then learn how to substitute with a cheaper yarn. I find the website yarnsub.com to be invaluable for this. So you just type in the yarn your pattern is asking for and you will get a list of similar yarns and how well they match the yarn in terms of tension, weight, and fibre type. I find certainly where I live there aren't many independent yarn stores nearby, and to buy some yarns which are sold in other countries can potentially cost a lot in shipping. So knowing how to substitute yarn has helped me find more accessible yarns without compromising on the type, weight or quality of the yarn. You can also use YarnSub in reverse. Use YarnSub to find similar yarns to your stash yarn and then search for patterns that use those similar yarns. So this is also a great way to use up your stash and avoid buying new yarn, which will cost you money both to buy and to store. Tip 2. Buy secondhand yarn. I am passionate about buying secondhand for most things in my life, and if you watch my knitting podcast you will probably know that already. I never buy new clothes or shoes. The only new garments I have are ones that I've made myself. And our first instinct when we need something new is to look on Gumtree, eBay or Facebook Marketplace before we think about buying something new. And yarn and things that can become yarn are no exceptions. Yes, it's true, a lot of charity shop yarn is pretty low quality, but sometimes you will find some gems of good yarn at secondhand places. I have in the past year or so become much more aware of using more natural fibres and less of the synthetic ones for environmental reasons. However, I am also really conscious that a lot of natural fibres are farmed and harvested in ways that are not ethical towards humans and animals. For example, cruel animal husbandry practices in sheep farming and poor pay and working conditions for cotton pickers in developing countries. So by buying secondhand, I see this as voting with my dollar. Not only am I saving money, but I'm reducing demand for the production of new goods, which may be produced in ways that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Another really fun thing you can do when buying secondhand yarn is to buy garments, unravel them and reuse the yarn. And this is a really good way to find good quality fibres to use as yarn. There are also a couple of Etsy shops I know of that do this for you as well. In Australia, I know there is an Etsy shop called Unwound Recycled Yarn. In the States, there is an Etsy shop called Recycled Yarn, and these ladies find secondhand garments, unravel them, and will sell you the yarn. However, it is fun to do some hunting yourself, and depending on which charity shop you look at, you can find some really good quality natural fibres like cashmere and wool. So the shawl that I'm working on at the moment is actually made from a cotton jumper that I unravelled and dyed myself. The jumper cost me $8 and the shawl is using maybe half of that yarn. And also don't forget t-shirt yarn. So I have made some really thick and durable oven mitts by cutting up $1 secondhand t-shirts. If I can find the pattern I used, I will link it down below because it is a really good one and it's a free pattern as well. Tip 3, buy smart when you buy new. So this means buying in bulk when you can. I know that in Australia there are woolen mills such as Bendigo woolen mills, Nundle woolen mills, and places like that which sell yarn in bigger balls that you can often see in yarn shops. You can also even buy yarn by the cone, a kilo at a time. I've thought about doing this myself, and then I can hand dye the yarn myself, which will both save me money and also I can make the yarn exactly how I want it. It is also worth looking at whether these bulk yarn suppliers will sell mill ends for you at a discount. So these might be more fiddly to work with, there perhaps might be more breaks in the yarn, more knots, but if you can handle weaving in a couple more ends, it may be worth the saving for you. So look into yarn shops and woolen mills which will sell mill ends to you. Tip 4, network, or I suppose simply share your passion with knitters and non-knitters alike. And I'm not saying that you should do this so that you might get free yarn or a lead on a place where you can buy cheap yarn, but by sharing your passion for knitting with others, you may, as a side effect, open up some doors for yourself. It's kind of like making a name for yourself in your career. Networking and making friends is important. By being open about what you love and what you do, other people will respond with kindness. And not to mention, sharing your love of yarn and knitting lets people around you know what you'd appreciate as a gift as well. And I have received some really beautiful knitting pattern books from loved ones which I cherish. I know when I was a student at uni doing my honours research, my lab was next to that of another girl in my honours year. I'd been at uni with her for years, but I didn't know her name or anything about her. And then one day she saw me knitting, and it turns out that she was a knitter as well. And we would spend our spare moments knitting together. And one day she gave me a bag of alpaca yarn that her mother had bought and never used. And it was such a touching moment. And it happened because I was open with my knitting. I've never been afraid to knit in public. So you never know who is out there wanting to share something with you. Tip 5, when buying secondhand needles, look for quality, and I would suggest metal. So I have been gifted a lot of secondhand plastic needles, which I don't love. I know some people like plastic, but I'm not a fan. Some of them snap, others are just kind of yucky to use, and they make my tension a lot looser than normal, and I'm already on the looser side. So wooden and bamboo needles are a little bit better, but if they have been kept in a damp area or are simply very old, you may have issues with them breaking or snagging on your yarn. That said, I would say that at least 80% of my knitting needles are secondhand, and many of them are inherited. In fact, my first kind of stash of knitting needles was my grandma's, and I found them after she'd passed away. But my favourite secondhand needles are metal ones. And if they've been well looked after, not chipped or rusted, they work perfectly well and they won't snap. At worst, they may be bent, which is not ideal, but do remember that you are also saving them from landfill as well as saving money. The tips of metal needles will also wear down slower than those of other materials, so you will need to replace them less often. Tip 6, take good care of what you have. So this is pretty self-explanatory really, but if you look after your knitting needles and notions, they will last longer, you won't lose them, and then you won't have to replace them as often. So for example, the project bag that I use, which is for now finally giving up the ghost, was a cheap bag that I got when I was about 16, which I repurposed for knitting. It has seen me through a decade of knitting now, and only recently has it started to get holes in it. So as well as that, keep your needles organised and your everyday notions in the one notions pouch to prevent you from losing any of them and having to replace them. Another side note on notions is it is very easy to use cheap or free stitch markers by making your own out of scrap yarn, or I've recently, as I showed on my most recent podcast episode, made some out of secondhand buttons and beads which I already owned. Tip number 7, say yes to hand-me-downs. So this does go back to the networking tip, but it is more specifically about being open to things that other people don't want anymore and seeing value in what is discarded. I have been given a lot of yarn, needles and notions from people who know that I knit and who have inherited a supply of knitting things. I even have some yarn and notions from my husband's grandmother, whom I never met, but the yarn holds a special place for me, and I have used it to make things for my own kids to pass something on to them from her. So this not only connects you to knitters from generations past, but it saves the item from being thrown away or otherwise not loved, as well as saving you money. Tip number 8, give away your knits as gifts. So you'll be knitting anyway, you can save money on gifts by knitting as much for others as you can. And I know that a lot of people have had some disheartening experiences with people not appreciating your knitted gifts that you've put a lot of work into, so I do have a couple of tips around avoiding that too. First of all, knit for toddlers. I know that the toddlers that I have knitted for, often my own kids, but others too, have always loved the clothes and toys that I've knitted for them. I can also personalise the gifts for the child. So for example, when my nephew was little, his dad, my brother, was in the Navy. I knitted one of Jean Greenhouse's patterns for an elephant in a sailor's suit, and I modified the sailor's uniform so that it matched my brother's ceremonial naval uniform. And you can personalise gifts for adults as well, and if you pick the right person, it can be a really very much loved gift. Tip number 9, if you've got the yarn and you need the thing, make it instead of buying it. So you and I both know that if you're a knitter, there is a 99% chance that you already own a lot of yarn, and yarn that you don't have plans for. And like any human, sometimes we find that we are in need of a little knittable garment or tool. For example, dishcloths, washcloths, reusable makeup remover pads, and hats. So when my daughter was little, when she was a baby, she would outgrow her hats all the time, as babies do. I could have gone out and bought her a cheap hat to replace it, but I already owned yarn, which I had already spent money on, and which I had no other designs on. So I made her hats with it. It's as easy as that. If you've already spent the money on the yarn and you don't plan to use it, make something useful with it. And even better if you can make something that you can use again and again. And that way you can save even more money by not buying the disposable version of household items like washcloths and makeup remover pads. And finally, tip 10 for knitting on a budget. Use free patterns. It is wonderful to support knitwear designers by buying their patterns, and I do make a special effort to do this now, but in the past I rarely did. You do have the option of using free patterns. There are literally tens of thousands of free knitting patterns on Ravelry. And that is the English patterns alone. If you can't find what you're looking for, you can always learn to modify a pattern that is close to what you want. And you can still pay it forward and support the designers who are offering these free patterns by sharing your finished objects on your social media, your Ravelry projects, and your blog if you have one. Another great source of free patterns which I used all the time as a student was my local library. You can borrow some brilliant pattern books as well as knitting magazines and never run out of things to knit, all using patterns that cost you no money. So, there are my 10 tips for knitting on a budget. As you can probably tell, I have a soft spot for using secondhand items, which both saves money and is better for the environment, so you can do two good things at once, but there are many other ways to save money too. I hope you found these tips helpful, and please do share your own tips in the comments below. I will see you next time. Bye.